And welcome again to the Ivory Tower Collections. This is going to be part 3, and I believe the final part to my Roland MT-200 sequencer and sound module series. In this particular video, I am going to focus on how I have my MT-200 connected up to my computer to use it primarily for old DOS games, like the adventure games. So that's what we're going to focus on in this video. And yes, all this mess of stuff is going to be discussed. So let's talk about the MT-200 itself in this case. There's a lot of things that I'm going to show you in this video that can actually be applied to multiple different types of sound modules and not just the MT-200, as there's a lot of similarities in how you would connect them up and make them work on your particular computer system. So the MT-200, I've already covered quite a bit about this module in my previous 2 videos, so I'm not going to go into too much detail other than, again, if you're just seeing this, the MT-200 is basically a sequencer and sound module all in one device. It's designed to not only allow you to play MIDI music through it, utilizing its built-in GS sound bank, but also gives you the ability, with its included 3.5-inch diskette drive here, to save MIDI music onto diskette and play them back, similar in like a jukebox, if you will. But in this particular video, we're more concerned about how to make it work with our computer. So for that, we need to talk about the back of the module. And here we are. So, the back of the module. Things that are most important, let me get something to point with. Always got to have something to point with. I think I'll use this instead. Here we go. So I've talked about the back of the module before, but I'll go over briefly again what each of these different options are. So what we have is, we have obviously our DC power connection over here. We have a headphone connector, the left channel output, the right channel output, and then various connections for pedal devices to start and stop playback, as well as change effects while you're recording music. Then we have the MIDI interface ports themselves with the MIDI input, a MIDI throughput port, and then the specific digital piano input and output ports for using with an external MIDI controller or digital piano. The ports that we are most concerned with are going to be the audio output ports and the MIDI in and throughput ports, possibly, in this particular video, or in this particular setup. So let's talk about how I'm going to connect this thing up. Well, basically, in a nutshell, what has to be done is I have to have a means to get MIDI messages sent to the module so it understands what kind of instruments to play and how to play them. Additionally, I need a means to be able to output the audio that the module puts out back into my computer so I can hear the tones and sounds that it plays. So here's the items we're going to need to do that, at least in my particular case. You might need different cables or setups, but you'll get the basic idea. The first and probably most important part to this whole puzzle is how we're going to make it interface to the computer in the first place through the MIDI input port. And that, I would recommend this. This is the Roland UM1 Mark II. It is, in a nutshell, a USB to MIDI input interface. Now, there's a couple of other different brands, actually lots of different brands, that do the same thing, that have a USB to MIDI in and output interface to work with your computer. And they're going to be, I'm just going to say it, they're going to be cheaper solutions than what the Roland is. However, in videos that I've seen and forum boards that I have visited and read up on, it would appear that it can be very much, your mileage may vary with the off-brand or alternate brand of USB to MIDI input devices. Because of that, I settled on the one that I read about that didn't seem to have any compatibility issues and seemed to do everything it needs to do, especially working in intelligent NPU mode, which is important in the particular case of old games. And that is the the Roland UM1 Mark II. Now, you can get these for various prices. I actually got this as a brand new one. It wasn't what I originally was shopping for, but the wife got it for me as a surprise, so she went ahead and bought me a new one. And it was probably about $50, I think, plus shipping, so kind of pricey. But I have seen them used and seen them on eBay for far cheaper prices. But I would definitely recommend going with the Roland UM1. So that's the first thing you need, is a USB to MIDI interface type device like this. The other things you're going to need is you're going to need a way to be able to get the audio from the module put out back to your computer. There are a couple of ways that you can go about this depending on what kind of hardware you have. So let's talk about some of the stuff you're going to likely need. And again, this will depend on how your module works. You might need something like a simple 1/8 inch to 1/8 inch headphone type stereo cable, such as this. Or you might need something like this, which is a RCA left and right to 1/8 inch headphone type jack and adapter. Okay. Or you might need something more robust depending on how you're connecting it up. In this case, we have straight RCA to RCA, and this is some shielded higher quality cable that I have on hand. And all of this is, again, just a means to get audio out from the module into either your computer or into an external amplifier, however you wish to listen to it. So why do I have all these different cables here? What's the purpose here? Well, it's going to depend on what you want to connect it to and how you want to hear the music or sounds coming from the device. So in the particular example that I'm going to use, let me show you a sample cable setup on what I'm going to need. And honestly, it doesn't really require these. Although these are really, really nice, I won't need these in the particular setup I'm using it for. Instead, I need something simpler, like this RCA to single headphone 1/8 inch plug. And that's because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these RCA jacks here as the connections from the audio output channels off the module. And then I'm going to use the headphone jack connection input connector here to go back into the line in on my sound card on my computer. That way the audio coming out of the module comes into the line in on the sound card and is then mixed seamlessly with everything else on my computer so I can hear the audio from it. However, I have a bit of a snag in this case. You'll notice that these are standard RCA type male connections. And obviously for the module side of things, it would need to have the female RCA out connections. But that isn't what I have on my MT-200. My MT-200 instead has these 1/4 inch audiophile or studio quality type connections, which are much larger. And obviously we can't have, or obviously RCA isn't going to fit into this. So what do? Well, I went out and I had to purchase some separate 1/4 inch to RCA adapters. Now, because each of these channels is only putting out just one channel a piece, you don't have to get more expensive stereo adapters like I have here. Because you'll notice that I have the two bands on the end of this. That indicates that we've got the left and right, or it's basically two separate channels plus the ground. You could get by using one like this, except that you'll notice that this only has an 1/8 inch plug on the end of it. That's basically for something else. But they do make adapters like this from RCA to 1/4 inch with just a single channel in mind. And I actually own some that I use on a sound mixer that I have. But I would use something like this, and I would need two of them to plug into the back of my Roland module here. And that gives me the RCA outputs that I require. At that point, I can then connect up the RCA jacks on the back of the audio cable and run it out to my computer's line in port. Now, keep in mind that doing something like this and utilizing something like this is going to add some depth to the overall setup. You can see that this sticks out. Oh, that's probably a good 2.5 inches, probably just shy of 3 inches with it all put in place. So if you're going to have this up against a wall or something, keep in mind you're going to need some space behind it for your cables. So obviously probably not the most elegant solution. You can actually get cables that are already 1/4 inch inputs on the ends like this and get them to either 1/8 inch headphone or to another 1/4 inch stereo, which is what I actually use because my particular sound card has 1/4 inch inputs on the back of it. So I actually have single channel left right 1/4 inch to a stereo 1/4 inch connection. So that's how I get the sound out of my module into that. But remember, I also mentioned earlier in this that I was also talking about the MIDI-Thru connector. Well, you know what? Before I talk about the MIDI-Thru, let me talk about an alternate method that's even less cabling. Now, on my particular module, and I would suspect quite a few modules feature this, we do have, in addition to the left and right separate channels, I also have a headphone output port right here. Well, you could use the headphone output port to also go to your line in as well. It would work basically the same way. So really, I have two different ways I can do this. And if I use just the headphone port, then I have less cables involved. That's where I would use this particular adapter, which is a 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch adapter, stereo. Plug it in, and then use something like these cables, which are just standard headphone 1/8 inch to 1/8 inch, to plug on the back of that, and then the other end into my sound card's line input port. And it also doesn't take up, it sticks out a bit, but it doesn't stick out as much as the other cable assembly setup did. So that is, of course, another option, and can also be done fairly simple and fairly inexpensively as well. So let's talk about the MIDI-Thru port and why I mentioned it to begin with. Well, here's the reason why I'm mentioning all this. So let me get this UM1 out of the box, the USB to MIDI adapter, and show you how all this will be connected. So let's talk about how I'm going to connect up the MIDI ports up to the computer. And remember, I mentioned at the beginning that the key to that is this box right here, the Roland UM1 Mark II MIDI interface device. Now, there's not too much to say about this. It's pretty much a self-contained MPU intelligent controller that converts the it converts the USB signals from your computer and translates them into basically the serial information that's usually transmitted through the 5-pin DIN connectors used on standard MIDI devices. It's been in use since, I guess, about the early 80s, I guess, and still used today. So yes, it's basically a translator. It basically, for all intents and purposes, it's a USB to serial device, quite honestly. Now, obviously, it has a little bit more than that, but in a nutshell, that's essentially what it's doing. Now, the UM1 is not very complicated. You basically just have to plug in the USB portion to your computer to an available USB 2 port. It is capable of using USB 3, but it does not increase speed or anything like that. So it just needs a USB 2 port to function, which pretty much every computer in the last decade at minimum, if not longer, has had. And then you've got your 2 MIDI connections on the other end. And the MIDI connectors are marked. I'll see if the camera will focus in on or show that. It may not, because the lighting is not ideal. And it's probably not going to show it. And I apologize for that. But let me see if I can get the spot closer. Put at an angle. You can kind of see there that it does say MIDI in on that particular one, and obviously the other one says MIDI out. And that's because that's exactly how you're going to connect it up to the back of the Roland itself. So yes, you simply take a look, and this one says MIDI in, so it's going to go into the MIDI input port on the back of my Roland, and then I have a MIDI out, which actually I don't need, but if I did need to use it, I would actually connect it up to my MIDI out on the piano side here. But again, I'm not going to be using that part. But that takes us to the MIDI-Thru connector. And why would you need to worry about that? Well, if you only have just the one sound module, then you don't need to worry about it. All you have to do is just use the MIDI in connector on the one end of the Roland UM1 Mark II, and then just have the other end of the USB connected into your computer. And that's all you'd have to worry about, and it would function up for you. But if you have a different module, or if you have 2 modules, multiples, I actually do. I have an MT-32 in addition to this MT-200. Then I actually use the MIDI-Thru port with another MIDI cable, which is basically just something like this, but it's got the male connection on both ends. And I go from the MIDI-Thru to the MIDI in on my other module. And basically, in this particular case, the UM1 Mark II will pass the MIDI information to the first device, in this case my MT-200. It passes through the MIDI-Thru port into the MIDI in on the secondary module. So in essence, both modules will receive the MIDI messages at the exact same time to function. So that's very handy. So really that's all I have to do to connect things up. So basically all the wiring that I would have would be the MIDI connection here, and then I would have audio connection, coming out the back here, going into my computer, into the line in port like I specified, and then of course obviously I would need to have my power adapter, which I do have right here. And that's the basics of what I would need to connect off the back of the module to make it function into my computer. So in the next segment, I'm going to talk about the software itself. Okay, so let's get started with some of the software aspects here. So the first thing is that we need to get the UM1 Mark II Roland USB to MIDI device cable interface working in our operating system. Now, everything I'm going to show you is from my Windows 10 system, running a 64-bit version of Windows 10. But I would imagine it's similar, if not pretty much the same for most others. Now, the first thing I will tell you is that I had seen some other mentions online as well as in other YouTube videos that state that you should probably attach the UM1 USB to MIDI device after you have the drivers installed. And that's actually a pretty good idea, and that's because in most cases the drivers will set resources up in a particular way so that when you actually plug the USB device in, it will be more easily recognized and picked up by the software that drives it. So in this case, let's start with that. So again, I'm working on Windows 10. Now I will say that with Windows 10 you really don't need any drivers because it's essentially been built into Windows already. So if you just plug the USB to MIDI interface cable into an available USB port on your computer, it will just fire up and find the drivers for it and just pretty much work out of the box. At least that was my experience. However, if you don't have Windows 10 and you have a different operating system instead, you can very easily get the drivers for this particular USB MIDI device from Roland themselves. So I'm just going to go out to Roland.com in this case, and I am in the US and it recognizes that. Go to Highlight Support, then just click on Updates and Drivers. This will load up the Updates and Drivers page. Now since we're talking about the UM1 Mark II, we need to click on the T-Z or T through Z listing and scroll, 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 scroll. Here we go. Now you have to be careful here because you'll notice that there are other variances of things called this. Here there's a UM-1 USB MIDI interface, and you might be tricked into thinking this is what you're looking for. It's not. That's because what we're really looking for is a little further down, and it's this one here, the UM-ONE Mark II USB MIDI interface. So when I click on this, this is going to show me a list of all the different driver sets that are available. Now again, I happen to be using Windows 10, so for me, I would click on the driver for Windows 10. If you're using the Mac operating system or Windows 7, Vista, and even if you're still on XP, you're pretty much covered here. So Roland has drivers and continues to update and support drivers for all of their various devices in one way or another for the most part. And this is especially true for these USB to MIDI interface devices. So I'm going to click on the one here for Windows 10 as an example. And this will take me to the information page talking about it, what it's for. This says that it is compatible with Windows 10 64 and 32, but it is not compatible with the Windows 10 Mobile Edition apparently. And of course it's designed for any PC that's got an available USB port. Now it will tell you a couple of things to note here. It says Intel chipsets recommended. It says it may not perform to its full specs when used with an added USB 2.0 interface card. It says it cannot be used with a USB 3 port that's not compatible with USB 2, which is kind of strange because I'm not really aware of a USB 3 port or USB 3.0 type port that's also not backward compatible. But anyway, it does not work correctly when connected to a USB 3 port. You'll need to connect it to a USB 2 port. So basically just keep in mind that although USB 3.0 is commonly and becoming even more widely available on devices, the UM Mark I is a USB 2.0 device. So just keep that in mind. It says it cannot be used in virtual Windows environments such as Hyper-V or Virtual PC. So again, just read through everything. You've got your usual requisite licensing agreement. You click the little box to agree to everything and then click and download the file. And you'll get the file and it will download fairly quickly. So at that point you would just need to install the file. So the first emulator I will talk about in using the Roland UM1 Mark II with your MIDI device or with your sound module is the ScummVM emulator. Now, of course, ScummVM has been around a very long time and has grown up quite a bit since its humble beginnings of basically just being able to play some of the earlier LucasArts adventure games such as Loom and the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade games. It can now play Sierra as well as a host of other games as well. So the ScummVM emulator is a really good choice for a lot of these classic DOS type adventure games from back in the day. And many of these adventure games, of course, utilized General MIDI as their music source. So let's talk about it real quick. So ScummVM, this is version 2, obviously dated from December of 2017, so it's not the newest, I'm sure, but it gets done for what I need, and for the most part, everything I show here should be fairly the same for pretty much any version of ScummVM, I would imagine. So I've got ScummVM loaded. I'm just going to go to my options here, and there's a few things I just need to set. So if I go to the audio, the first thing I do is I go to my preferred device and I make sure that I have it set for the UM1 under Windows MIDI right here. The other thing is if I go to the MIDI tab, I also make sure that for General MIDI device I have the UM1 specified. I also like to click the mixed ad-lib MIDI mode for any games that sometimes don't have full sound effects in the General MIDI device format. The games, or at least ScummVM, will automatically usually also provide an ad-lib sound effect as well, so I will frequently have that checked. If by chance you actually happen to have an MT-32 connected up instead of a Roland General MIDI device, the basic rules are the same. You would actually specify that you would go to the MT-32 tab, specify what the device interface is, which would be the UM1 Windows MIDI. If you have an actual MT-32, then you would check the box for a true Roland MT-32, which disables GM emulation. But if you have a sound canvas type device like I do, then you would specify a Roland GS device, which basically tries to enable MT-32 mappings through the General MIDI device. It's not very accurate, but I guess if you haven't got an MT-32, it's better than nothing for those games that pretty much only have MT-32 or Sound Blaster type music and sound. And then you can apply those settings and OK them. And basically what would happen at this point is games that automatically would support General MIDI would utilize the UM32, or I'm sorry, UM32, the UM1 Mark II to output their MIDI signals through and ultimately to your sound canvas, or in this case my MT-200 Roland sound module, and I would be able to get the music and sounds through that. Obviously, if you have a game that you need to change the settings for, maybe you prefer the way it sounds under a different, sound driver, maybe you don't want to listen to it through your General MIDI type device, then obviously you can highlight that game in question, like maybe Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis here. You can edit the individual games, and then you can override the settings as need be. Maybe you would prefer to listen to something that uses a sound font, because this version of ScummVM does have essentially Fluid Synth built into it and has the ability to utilize sound fonts. Well, you could certainly do that. Or perhaps you have games where they support both a General MIDI and an MT-32, but maybe you prefer one versus the other. Well, then you can obviously go into the appropriate tabs like the MT-32 tab here, overwrite them as needed, and click whichever box you need. And that pretty much sets up what you need to know for ScummVM. It's really not that difficult. Since ScummVM is a Windows emulator for, true and true, it automatically sees the UM1 as a selectable MIDI device, and so anything connected through the UM1 Mark II should be picked up, and it should be able to function just fine. Now let's talk about DosBOX a little bit. Now, the thing with DosBOX is that it does support the ability to use different USB-MIDI devices for interfacing to an actual sound module, so that you can in fact play many of the old DOS games through DosBOX and hear the sound and music through an external sound module. Now, DosBOX is a little more complicated to get set up and working, but really not that much more difficult. So I'm going to show you a few things here. So I've got actually a pre-compiled version of DosBOX. It's a little bit different, but the same rules apply because I've tried it in other versions as well. So let me just start with a clean screen here. And the first thing you need to know about DosBOX is that you're going to have to change the configuration file for DosBOX in order to utilize the UM1 Mark II interface device properly. And in order to do this, there's one particular piece of information you're going to need to know. And that is that you need to know what the MIDI ID is of the UM1 on your particular computer. Now, I happen to know what it is on mine, but it could be something different on yours. But luckily, DosBOX gives you a way to sort of see this. From a basic prompt within DosBOX, simply use the mixer command followed by the parameter switch /list MIDI, just like that. When you hit enter, DosBOX is going to show you the available MIDI devices that it detects that it can interact with and use. In this case, it shows device 0 as being the built-in Microsoft GS wavetable synth, which is usable if you don't have an external synthesizer. I'll just leave that at that. Or you have, in my case, it shows device 1, which is 3-UM-1. So in this particular case, although I have a 3 in front of the name being shown for UM1, it's the 1 that I am interested in. And that's because I'm going to have to specify that 1 in the DosBOX config file. So let me show you what that's going to look like now. We're now looking at my particular DosBOX configuration file. Now, if you're not sure where this is kept, I'll kind of show you. For the most part, it's kept inside of your user profile within Windows is usually where this is hiding. And I'll see if I can't provide a separate section for that here later. But the important things is that once you find the configuration file, this is how I have mine edited, at least, to work for me to utilize my Roland sound module devices. So you want to go through the config and find the section listed for MIDI itself. Now I'm going to drop down here and I'm going to show you the particular MIDI configuration options I have in use. First is that the MPU-401 needs to equal the intelligent mode. As it turns out, the Roland UM1 Mark II does seem to emulate intelligent mode operation quite seamlessly. At least I haven't had any issues with it. And you know, I do realize again that the UM1 Mark II is not the cheapest USB to MIDI interface device out there. In fact, it's probably one of the most expensive. But I went with it just because from everything I had read and had seen, and personally in my own use, I haven't had any problems with it. It works great. It's pretty much seamless out of the box and does everything I need it to do. So again, at least for the MPU-401 mode, it needs to equal intelligent. The MIDI device, I have mine set to equal Win32. This basically just means that I want it to specifically use the Windows 32 MIDI configuration. And then right here we have the MIDI config. Now this actually says it's set to 2, which is interesting because technically that shouldn't work. That's because I need to set that to MIDI config equals 1. That's because it needs to match, again, the previous thing I showed you where I did the mixer / list MIDI. So the MIDI config is which MIDI device under the Windows 32 driver set do you want it to use. And again, that number here has to match whichever one the UM1 shows up as from the list MIDI options. From there really isn't anything else that you need to specify. I do have a few other additional options here, as you can see, but that's because I also happen to have an MT-32 connected as well as my MT-200. But for the most part, all you would need for your MT-200 or a similar sound canvas or other general MIDI device to work is basically just that. That's really it. That's really all you'd have to have configured in the MIDI section for a general MIDI device to function. Figured you might be curious to see how all this connects up to my computer, so here we go. Up here is my MT-200 and below it is another sound module I have, an MT-32. But again, we're focusing primarily on the MT-200. So here's how the MT-200 is connected up to my computer system. We have to start with the Roland UM1 USB MIDI interface device right here, which I've already got connected and working on my computer. We have to take the MIDI in cable, which is this one here, and I'm going to plug it into the MIDI in port on the MT-200 right here. Just like that. Again, I don't really need the MIDI output port because I'm not going to really be recording anything from the MT-200. The other thing I'm going to need, of course, is I'm going to need a way to get the audio source out of the MT-200 back into my computer itself. And this is where my audio cables will come into play. Again, I've got a set of 1/4" to RCA cables here. So I'm going to get those plugged in. Just like that. These will get connected to something else in a second. Gotta have power, of course. So here's a power adapter plug. Excellent. Now at this point, once I have the audio cables connected up to the line-in source on my computer, that's really the minimum I would need to operate the MT-200. But my setup's going to be a little bit more complicated because I do have a secondary module in place. And for that, this is where my MIDI-Thru port on the MT-200 gets used. So for that, I need an additional MIDI cable right here. I've got a small 3-footer. This is about the smallest I could find at the time. And it's just male-to-male 5-pin DIN connectors for MIDI operations. So one end will go into the MIDI-Thru port from the MT-200 up here. And the other one will connect into the Roland, or into my sound module, the bottom sound module's MIDI input port right here. Just like that. And again, it allows them to daisy chain so that the MIDI input signals coming into the MT-200 will automatically be routed into the bottom sound module as well. So both modules will receive the same MIDI channel signals at the same time. And of course I got to get power applied to this one as well. Just like that. And I have another set of audio cables, again 1/4 inch to RCA, for my bottom module as well. Now, again, the reason why I didn't connect these up originally is because another thing I have to do here, in order to be able to hear both modules, not really simultaneously, but be able to switch between them as I'm playing different games or using different programs, I use just a very simple audio-video switch box right here. Nothing fancy about it at all. This is an old one I've had for a really long time. In fact, the S-video port is missing on it because I needed it for another project. But the rest of the connectors are good. So yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Now I will just need to connect them up. I'll take one of the modules here and connect it up into one set of ports. There you go, tighten that up. Get the other set of connectors and plug them in just like that. And then the last thing I would need is I would need to get the audio cables from the line in for my computer, and I would need to attach those off of my AV switch box just like that. And again, this entire setup, there's quite a bit of cables here. This entire setup allows me to switch between the two modules essentially on the fly, depending on what I'm operating. So there is quite a bit of extra space that's needed in the back, but this is about as consolidated a setup as I can get. So in the next set of the video, I will show you how it all operates.